Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Tulasi Sivalinga, Manager of Programming Events here at ASBN, and we're so excited to be hosting an Ecosystem Day event at the Skoll World Forum. And we are going to be continuing the theme of the event, which is discussing bold and equitable solutions to pressing social problems. We have an incredible panel today that I'm excited to hear about, and I will let David Levine here from ASBN introduce them and speak more about what we're here to talk about today.
Great. Well, thank you. And you could start those slides whenever you're ready there, and we'll get moving. But yes, I'm David Levine, and I am the president of the American Sustainable Business Network. And we are thrilled to now be a part of the Skoll community. As a recent grant recipient, we couldn't be more thankful for that support to really help to grow our just, inclusive, sustainable economy work that we do, which is so core and central to our efforts. So we can go to the next slide then. As a part of our work, what we consider ourselves to be is a movement builder, coalition builder, an alliance builder that connects business leaders, investors, business organizations, social entrepreneurs, BIPOC entrepreneurs, women leaders, the wide range of leaders out there that together we could build into a greater voice and power to create the systemic change that's needed. And, it is that regenerative, just, and prosperous economy that we need to be building together. And it's only through our collective efforts do we see the ability to make that change happen. We can go to the next slide. So we approach the work in a variety of different ways. As I mentioned just now, the coalition and movement building is so important to us, but so is creating the business case, the thought leadership that helps us articulate this other economic paradigm. It's no longer a shareholder paradigm. It's not a short-term profit at all costs. It's not the extractive way of thinking about the economy, but rather it is the regenerative, the restorative, the just, the equitable, the inclusive economy, the stakeholder economy that we're looking to help to build together with so many different players out there. The other piece is that we look to drive towards the movement of capital, right? How do we create the impact through the investing? How do we move philanthropy dollars, the investment dollars? How do we move public and private dollars in order to make the kind of impact and create the long-term opportunity? Because without the financial support, it makes the organizing, it makes the implementation that much more difficult. And then there is the shifting of the rules of the game. How do we move both the company policies, but also the public policies? And how do we do that at the federal, at the state, at the local level? And we can move to the next slide. So just to give you a quick sense, not going to go into it today, but for us, it is many areas of work that need to be addressed. And when we're looking at policy shift or the market shift that needs to take place, to understand that you need to dive deep in each of these areas, but you need to see and make the connections between them in order to really have the impact that we need to see. Next slide. Additionally, it's in our approach, towards who we involve and how we approach it. We have sector-based business organizations across many different sectors. It's their diverse perspectives that are crucial to this work. It's building out the local and including the local and state business organizations. It's the creating of these coalitions. It's bringing in the businesses, the investors. It's the strategic partnership with communities, including a few that you'll hear from today. And it's the ability for us to create not only the coalitions, but the working groups to strategize around these areas, to create our sets of principles, priorities, and the opportunities to create the changes. When we do that together, that we're going to really be able to sort of, garner from the wisdom of such a diverse and powerful community. Next up. So, for our work around inclusive economy, again, we're approaching this from a number of different angles. We've got our investor circle, there's a restorative investing work, there's community capital work, there's looking at public-private partnership initiatives and the like, the work we're doing around CDFIs and the resource bank that we created there, our work to bring together diverse communities like this into our catalyzing community well-being work, worker ownership that you'll hear a bit about today as well, and the high road workplace. So all of these and other aspects are so crucial to understanding that we need multiple strategies. There's no one way in on this work. Next slide. So today, you're going to hear from a great body of wisdom and experience and strength and advocacy and power for helping the key people that are helping to create the shift that we're talking about here today. So, first off, we're going to turn to April D. Simone, a principal in Trahan Architects. And then we'll keep moving from there. And so first up, April, let's turn to you.
Great. Thank you so much for those comments, David, and reinforcing this aspect of regenerative ecology. Part of my role as a spatial practitioner is looking at the role of architecture in the built environment. And we know in 1968, Whitney M. Young gave a speech to the American Institute of Architects talking about the complacent and complicit role that we play in creating or spatializing inequity. A lot of our work, both at Trahan Architects and our platform Designing for Democracy, which we'll be launching this year, is really looking at what is the plurality and agency to redefine spatial practice or spatial practitioners, where all of us, as David highlighted in that chart, really begin to understand the transdisciplinary approach, and whether it's through investment, whether it's through starting businesses, whether it's through policy, that we play in spatializing concepts of healing, equity, and justice. How, in fact, do each of these principles show up, or ideologies show up that are critical to these concepts of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? We work across the city. And for me, one of the biggest roles as a board member at the American Sustainable Business Network is to really begin to advocate for more practitioners who look like me, who come from cultural experiences like myself, to sit at a table where only 0.4% of us are represented as licensed architects, and only 2% of us throughout this country are represented. And when we talk about concepts of equity, how can we speak to that without doing the proper investment into these spaces, whether it's starting businesses? There's little to no Black-owned architect firms in this country, very small number. And if we see that across the board, that people may not have the understanding around what we do or what their impact is, how can you begin to infuse this knowledge? So we operate on 3 principles: pedagogy, process, and spatial practice. How does understanding ecosystems, not just siloed projects, but how, using the word regenerative, it influences an entire ecology? So we begin this with every client we work with to really understand, how does your project, what is the opportunity for your project to really respond back to these concepts of inequity, injustice, and a myriad of other spatial infractions that, again, keep us at living to the full potential of what democracy can be in this country. And from there, we begin to use design as a medium, and then to visualize. If we do it this way, if we design that way, I think it would be an amazing opportunity then to how do we invite people to see themselves as part of this work. So I'll share further as we go along in this discussion, but it becomes imperative at who's at the table, who's making decisions, and how do the optics of how we do this work really reflect, not just in rhetorical nods around, again, we the people, but really embed in this longer term process the potentiality through understanding a more diverse framework of master planning, how we can interject innovative abilities that really again center around this concept of an inclusive and equitable economy. I'm going to pass it on back to David to introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
Great, thanks, April. So next up, I would like to turn to Damien Goodmon, who we've had the pleasure to be able to work with and to support the incredible work that they're doing in Crenshaw community. Damien is the CEO of Downtown Crenshaw and Liberty Ecosystem. So Damien, thanks for joining today.
And thank you, David. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, especially with such an incredible panel of practitioners, but especially in this space and part of this conversation. As David said, I'm the founding board member and CEO of Downtown Crenshaw Rising and the director of Liberty Community, in the Liberty Ecosystem. I live and I come to you from the Crenshaw community of South Central Los Angeles, which is the last bastion of a concentrated Black community within LA. Very ironically, most of the people who were among the current founding of the city were of African descent, and we are now the only race that's anticipated to see a numerical decline every decade into the future as the city anticipates to go. And what I present today, I have to begin by underscoring that it is a product of really 30 years of work that goes back to the 1992 unrest, with the question of how to rebuild the community that had been long deprived, divested, disempowered. And much of what came from that uprising really focused on putting more dollars toward solutions that and programs that had just not been as well resourced previously. And I think we see the results. At the same time those discussions were being made, there were many radical practitioners, which were trying to make more mainstream, who really began to question how we're able to tackle this overall system of extraction, where decisions were being made by outside forces, and really focus in on long-term sustainable solutions that could heal the harms called, build the type of environment that would prevent such actions like the uprising from taking place. I know these terms today as restorative and reparative economics, where the power is being put back into communities where the decision-making comes from the ground up, not from the top down. And around 2019, myself and several other of these practitioners, many of whom live in the Crenshaw community and had at some point gone to certain places throughout the country, including Boston, working on the landmark Dudley Street Neighborhoods Initiatives, those who had been lifting up cooperatives here locally and building that ecosystem of cooperatives, those who had been engaged in truly transformational actions and in really bringing to bear the best of solutions within this environment, coming focused here in Crenshaw, a place that is dealing with the highest housing price increases of the most unaffordable city in America by some estimates. And we began putting together the pieces saying, okay, first at its basis, much as Malcolm said, land is the basis of all freedom. How do we free the land? How do we take so much of these homes and apartment buildings that are in a speculative market where folks are being pushed out, home prices are tripling in just a few years? How do we take those off of the speculative market and bring them under community control so that the place can remain accessible to those that have long lived here? And at that, dealing with that large question, we really dove into the need for resources, recognizing that many ask for government resources, and trust me, they're needed, would come, but that there had to be a quicker, better way. And so with that dialogue, that internal dialogue that took place several months with some of our leaders, we began to dive in a little bit more into the socially responsible investment world, the social impact investment world. And dare I say, believe that is as strongly needed a solution for us as those public resources. Along the way, we knew that there need to be multiple products and multiple venues and avenues. And so, yes, and I'm sure you'll hear from many of the other panelists, we dove into and have started the process of becoming a CDFI so that we can bring in resources that way. We established a community development corporation. We've even looked into EB5 financing as an option, any way in which we can bring in good capital under our terms to combat the bad capital that is sweeping out and changing the cultural framework of our communities and so many others. And I think most of the things that got the biggest headlines were that when we engaged in this, we always knew that there would be some true opportunity sites as they're known. Spaces that were in our community that could be that place that we could not so much experiment, but really bring to fruition and actualize those many thought patterns, those many resources, those many creative financial solutions, cooperatively owned enterprises, and that ended up being the Crenshaw Mall. Downtown Crenshaw was a historic undertaking to purchase the largest commercial asset in Black Los Angeles and the largest proposed redevelopment project in the entire city of Los Angeles, and have it be brought under community control. And I have to say that I would hope that the results of that action, ultimately, the mall was sold to outside developer who has a lot of very interesting financial partners who will need to be wrestled the mall from his control into ours. But I think the project in itself showed what can happen when this strong level of philanthropic support can be matched with this strong support from the Social Impact Investment Committee to do something really transformative. We're talking a 40-acre project that's a build out of excess of $2 billion in finding those creative solutions, that entire process of bringing the community together, developing those different structures, and then finding the financial partners to do it is something that I hope will encourage others to do as we reimagine these massive projects. Because as we know, if you can find the creative solutions on a 40-acre site that's a $2 billion redevelopment, you can definitely find them in other spaces and places that are much smaller and with much smaller price tags. So I look forward to having this panel and taking your questions and sharing more about our incredible work.
Great, Damien, thank you. And next up is Clay Colombe, the CEO of the Rosebud Sioux Economic Development Corporation, another community and organization that we're proud to work alongside. I think they have a few more acres under their control here, but you know, and again, a whole systems approach to the kind of work through the indigenous worldview with the like. So Clay, please take it away.
Thank you, David. Hello, everybody. Yes, I am Clay Colombe, Chief Executive Officer for Rosebud Economic Development Corporation, which is the economic arm of the Rosebud Sioux tribe located in south central South Dakota. Yeah, we do have a few more acres, close to 1 million, which is just a fraction of what our traditional homelands were that were taken by the U.S. government through a couple of treaties. Won't get too deep into that, though. Just a little context on the Rosebud Reservation. United Nations Human Development Index takes into account income, education, life expectancy, and according to those factors, we are the worst place to live in the United States. You ask any of our tribal members, like, people vehemently disagree with that. And you know, you say that to, you know, that is part of the mindset that, you know, our organization, you know, we're looking at that, but not dwelling on how to, you know, create a better, you know, create the best place that we can for ourselves. And the way we're doing that is looking back to our traditional values and culture, a lot of which were taken from us, you know, over the last century through, you know, forcing our, you know, tribal members into boarding schools, you know, assimilation, whatnot. But the key focus of our culture that we at Redco have been are using for our foundation of every decision that we make is what we call the 7-gen approach. What that is, as Lakota, we are taught that every decision that we make needs to take into account the next 7 generations behind us. That is in our tribe's constitution. Again, that's basically the foundation of what we do at Redco. And again, we're calling that 7-gen. You know, causes us to do a lot of self-examination, looking at where we've been, where we're at, and where we're going. And in that process, we wanted to redefine what wealth means to us. And as Lakota, especially at Redco, we measure that in relationships, which the key ones are the relationship with our language, our culture, and the planet. So a little bit more about Redco. It was chartered by the Rosebud Sioux tribe to focus on economic development. A lot of, you know, most tribes have something similar to this. I think when it was created, it was kind of like, hey, we need one too. You know, start creating, you know, buying a few local businesses, starting a few, creating some jobs on the reservation. That was in 1999. In 2012, my predecessor as CEO, Weezy Pa Little Elk, was hired. And he, really jump-started the effort of what we were doing, looking at creating as many jobs as we could. But when we found something that wasn't enough, a lot of our tribal members didn't have the education or skills needed to do some of the jobs that we wanted to do. So we really had to start looking at, well, how do we fix that? Which, a normal for-profit business as we are, it's not something we would look at. So we started, getting some grants here and there to try to fix little pieces of this as we could. Became a whole new, basically, enterprise of what we are doing here. And in 2019, we created the Sichangu Community Development Corporation, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that is aimed at, starting to help fix some of these, underlying problems that our community was having. So it's really focused, one, on language revitalization. We have launched a immersion school. It's 2 years in now. It started as kindergarten. We now have kindergarten, first grade. We'll go through K to 5. We've also started our Lokolia Wawina program, which has hired 7 tribal members to concentrate full-time on becoming fluent in our language. Another thing we're really excited about. Other things we're looking at: housing and homeowner assistance, educate our food sovereignty, access to capital, financial literacy, government contracting, number of things that we're looking at. One of the things, our recent projects that we like to highlight that shows the 7-gen approach in action is our Wolakota Buffalo Range. We have a 28,000 acre bison restoration project. It's managed ecologically, social, economic, and culturally. First buffalo arrived in 2020. We were expecting to have over 1,000 in about 2023 to 24. Happy to report that we will have that this spring. And it is now the largest native owned managed herd in the world. And it's great. We love that. The buffalo were the cornerstone of our economy, prior to colonization here. It was the cornerstone of our diet, everything in it, our housing, everything. So we are working to get back to that as much as we can in the year 2022. It's not going to go back to the way we were, but just one part of it, I'll say, on the diet side, being put on the reservation, having our way of life with the buffalo and our diet taken away from us has caused so many health problems, from diabetes to heart conditions, a number of them. So that's one way we're working to help increase the health of our community, while at the same time giving our people our traditional way of life back and working with the buffalo. I could go on for an hour, so I will stop there. Thank you, David.
No, thank you, Clay. Such important work. So we'll just keep moving, and Carmen Huertas Noble, the co-founder of One Worker, One Vote, ran into tremendous technical difficulties, and she is so apologetic. But we are so fortunate to have one of the other co-founders, Michael Peck, co-founder of One Worker, One Vote, and longtime partner of ASBN. Michael. Michael, we cannot hear you, Michael. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you, David. It is a pleasure to be here. Poor substitute for Carmen. But when people say it's a pleasure, my pleasure is grounded in over a decade of working with April, and also Damien, connecting the cooperative community. And our approach with ASBN has been something we call ownership for all, which is grounding worker ownership, equity, single share equity, and workplace democracy as the 2 fundamental precepts beyond which power resides. And we uplift the people that we're focusing on, the communities that we care about. Hard to take away equity and hard to take away democratic governance once you have it. And so we've gone right to the heart of the deindustrialized parts of America in this movement. And I want to talk about two particular places. Ohio, it's no longer a swing state, unfortunately, but when it used to be a swing state, it was facing a number of major confrontations, deindustrialization, all of the energy, Appalachia, especially in Southeast Ohio, all the changing in energy and the displacement, economies that were, rusted out and told to go fish, essentially, substituting good industrial jobs with food service jobs that didn't pay, jobs that, you needed 3 jobs to take care of your family, a lot of unemployment, a lot of racism, a lot of economic dislocation, and no answers coming from everybody. So what we did 10 years ago, an incredible group of people, I was not one of those people, but an incredible group of people started Co-op Cincy. You had a retired railroad engineer union leader, someone who worked in the Catholic Justice Peace Movement, one of the youngest, most gifted women labor organizers, and an immigrant from Peru who bootstrapped his way up from helping immigrants all over the country to getting a master's degree in finance and starting a very profitable company, a worker co-op that is now being franchised all over the country. But the important thing to know about Co-op Cincy, which is the name of this incredible ecosystem, is that 75% of the staff members are women, and 71% of the individuals employed in the co-op network are women. And we focus on creating new enterprises and jobs, and in managing those jobs so that the enterprises are successful. There's an old saying from Mondragon, which is the world's largest industrial co-op, where I come from, that you have to be profitable to be able to afford your values. So we've started things like Queen City Commons, which is a co-op business that provides clean and timely food scrap collection in Greater Cincinnati, started by women. We have other enterprises such as Queen Mother's Market, which is working to start a Black and women-led co-op grocery store in the Walnut Hills neighborhood, a food desert. Kroger store closed there a few years ago. We've started Hopesfield Farm to Table, which is operating food trucks that provide access to fresh, healthy food. And of course, we have our urban co-op farm, which is called Our Harvest. It was probably the first co-op that we started, which is a 40-acre urban farm, not at all the acreage that Clay has, unfortunately, but there we have worker owners, a union co-op, and we grow fresh produce. We distribute it to all the farmer markets, to the University of Cincinnati cafeteria system, and it's really been an organic source of hope for the neighborhoods, getting out of food deserts and getting into healthy diets. In Dayton, we've started something called Gem City Market, which has received a lot of press, totally brought a food desert, closed a food desert situation in Western Dayton. We have a trucking co-op. We have an urban mushroom farm. We have a fitness co-op. And of course, Co-op Dayton is famous because one of the founders, Leila Klein, she and her mom produced with President Obama, The American Factory, which was the first documentary that the Obama Foundation participated in on Netflix. Just to give you a breadth of the talent, these are people that could have done anything, and they chose to do this. And the results are being felt all over the country. We've helped with Community Catalyst, Cooperative Catalyst in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We're now focusing on the One Project in Oregon, which is building out an ecosystem in Portland, similar to our ecosystems in Cincinnati and Dayton. We're in Central Brooklyn working on healthcare and starting local minority-led businesses that are union co-ops. And basically, what this does is it doesn't just provide hope, and it also doesn't provide a good family and community sustaining job. And it just doesn't provide dignity. It provides freedom. The word freedom is something that's totally bandied about in this country and misused completely. But freedom in the marketplace starts with an equity share and starts with agency and a voice and a vote and a seat at the table, the big table, the table where the decisions are made. And these are lines that we cannot cross. We have to insist that these kinds of jobs belong to every single American. It is their divine right. And the people in here and the immigrants coming here, because we are an immigrant nation, all of us, except for the people who were originally here that we displaced. So I'm very passionate about this. This is a work that combines everybody. I want to thank ASBN, where I'm a board member, because ASBN has taken this flag up the hill when nobody else understood it. I'm very grateful to them. And I'm also grateful to be able to collaborate with Damien, who's a force of nature, and April, who's told me more about the juxtaposition of physical conflict and solutions, where it comes from, than anybody. So thank you very much for having me here. And when you get to meet Carmen, you'll get a better version of me, and she'll tell the story in a better way.
Well, you did quite well, as always. Thank you, Michael. And really, next up, is Val Red-Horse Mohl, the CFO of the East Bay Community Foundation, and proudly also, the co-chair of the board of directors of the American Sustainable Business Network. So Val, please.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be going last. I do think that the work I'm going to talk about is just essential to actually answer some of the problems and solutions actually that my other guests have been talking about. I am laser focused on moving capital to narrow and eliminate the wealth gap. And part of that is impact investing, which I'm going to talk about. But I want to frame it before I go. I made some slides, but before I go to my slides, if any of you in the audience were part of SVC, which is now part of ASBN, a few years ago, I had an epiphany when I was on stage. I was interviewing Anand Giridharadas, the author of Winners Take All, and he sort of challenged us, and he sort of made a statement that made me mad. He made a statement that all the work we're doing in all the nonprofits is sort of like putting Band-Aids on a patient that needs radical surgery. And I took offense to that because I think the work we're doing is very, very good. And I include all of us in that. However, he is right that if we don't work together to move significant amounts of capital, it's going to be these wonderful points of light, and we're not actually going to reach the solution. So what I'm working on is, how do we shift capital? How do we make it significant? How do we narrow that wealth gap? And I'm just going to share my screen and talk a little bit about what I do. I wanted to start with just sort of why, follow the money, why this is so important. Basically, 70% of the global population identifies as people of color and 40% of the US population, but we manage less than 1.3% of the world's capital. And so what that means is white male-led companies are making the decisions on where our capital goes and where it flows, ultimately where it reaches, what communities, what companies. And it's not intended for me to make a divisive statement. We have to work with white males, but this is just a skewed data point that needs to be addressed. I think you all know the definition of impact investing. I threw this in here, though, just to be clear that my definition is the proactive intention of making investments for a measurable positive impact alongside a financial return. I am not talking about philanthropic grants. I believe that we have to continue to prove that you can have impact and a financial return. They're not mutually exclusive, and that's a big myth today. Just thought I would cover very quickly the work we're doing at East Bay Community Foundation. We're based in Oakland. We manage a little under $1 billion worth of donor advice funds, and I was hired to completely launch their impact investing, both on the portfolio side, where I think we will see the most impact because that's larger, bigger dollars, as well as on the concessionary side in making impact investments from DAFs and into the community. I'm not going to cover everything that's on this page, but in the portfolio, we've actually changed our investment policy statement. We're moving capital to diverse managers. We're encouraging others to do the same. We're sharing our IPS. We're sharing our due diligence. On the concessionary side, we reframed an approach with legal review under IRS regulations, so impact investments could be made from donor advised funds. And we also launched programs to try to get some of those investments into companies founded by people of color in the East Bay. We're also encouraging other DAF fund managers and community foundations to do the same. Part of the process, though, was not easy. And so I encourage others to, reach out to me, because I do like to share the process we went through. We made specific changes to the IPS. We structured collaborative due diligence. We cleared it with legal review, and we have to have dedicated staff, board, and stakeholders. And again, I think this is what we all should be doing to kind of come together to address this issue. This page makes me cry. This was the first cohort of fund managers we invested into. You'll notice Edward Duggar there. He's at Reinventure Capital. He's a proud member of ASBN. But I will tell you that getting this money moved, we have an external consultant that's a bulge bracket firm, and I had to challenge their protocols, redefine risk, get them on a platform where they would not have been eligible because they were too small. They were considered emerging managers. To consider Ed Duggar an emerging manager is a joke to me because he's been around for 30 years managing money. But this is some of the trends I'm trying to really dispel in the financial markets. And I think if we work together, we're going to be able to do this. And the significance of this is when we hear what Clay is doing, we hear what Damien's doing and April is doing. These fund managers invest into companies who are then investing into communities, and that money can flow into communities in big, significant ways. And I'm talking billions of dollars, not just 50,000 here and there. So that's why I'm so passionate about it. I also did the program around DAFs, which I think it's very important. It's not as impactful, I think, as the portfolio side because it's a much smaller side. It is part of a grant making structure, but it just comes from DAFs into loans, loan agreements, loan guarantees and private equity investments. So we did the same process, a pretty heavy lift, but the one significance is with impact investments from DAFs or foundations, you often have more of an opportunity for matching programs than you would with a grant. And we were able to leverage some of our impact investments with 15-to-1 matching. The significance of this page, these are 3 of our donors. You can see they're all Caucasian, and they are very committed to being part of the movement to narrow the wealth gap. And they were part of this new program that I implemented, and they moved their money into all of these down here are focused on racial equity and community, or are founded by and here's some of that here. I pulled them up. These are some of the founders we supported in our local community. These businesses cannot go to the market and go get traditional venture capital. And so again, we're just continuing to try to move that capital in significant ways. And again, my thesis is to achieve racial equity, the wealth gap must be eliminated, and we must work together to achieve this. So I'm going to stop there. I may have gone over.
No, we haven't gone over enough yet. We got lots to do here, so and lots to say. So thank you. So you got some quick snapshots, and of course, feel free to follow up with us, and connect, both on the meta work as well as the individual communities. But to keep the conversation going a bit, wanted to tackle a couple of questions here and the like. And one is that in order to be able to work together, there needs to be some common set of principles and the like that we can come to, some guiding criteria and the like in order to build a more inclusive, restorative economy and the like. So I'm wondering if any of you want to jump in on what you consider to be some of the top principles or criteria that should really be guiding this work. You touched on it a bit in your talks, but maybe if we can pull those pieces out, that would be great to have.
I'll jump in. I know I went last, but I'll start in the opposite direction. So I love the work we do at ASBN because I think policy and regulation are tied to any of the work we do and to really accelerating it. And I don't take credit for this. It was actually Ed Duggar, but he was making suggestions around policy that would incentivize all of the trillions of dollars that right now is managed by all the big names, whether it's Bank of America or Merrill Lynch or Citigroup or Blackstone. What we found is punitive doesn't work as well as incentivizing. And so he has a whole bunch of ideas that if we move money into diverse managers or women fund managers or communities, that there's tax breaks and whatnot. And I think we do have to think about incentivizing the movement of capital if we want to talk in the billions and trillions. And then beyond that, from a more sort of just specific, not necessarily federal policy, but in the industry of finance, we have to redefine risk, because right now the way Wall Street defines risk is if you have been at your fund for less than 10 years, or if you don't have more than $1 billion under management, you're not going to qualify. And that basically defaults to white male-led funds. And so just redefining risk with data. And I think tech is a big part for all of the work that we do represented here with all of us. We can't ignore the fact that tech affects the work we do. And so again, just, thinking about bias in tech and bias in our systems and how we can change that.
Great. Michael, you want to jump in next? Thanks, Val.
Yes, thank you. In addition to what Valerie has said so eloquently, you know, one of the great things about ESG financing is it has four capital definitions. And really, the first time in humanity where financial capital has been joined by anything. So now it's joined by climate capital. Obviously, the world is figuring out how to do this, not as fast. We have 8 years, according to the latest UN report, before we all become toast. But the other two capital sectors, social and human capital, they're fascinating to me because nobody knows squat about social and human capital except for the people in our movements, the people that are actually doing the work on the ground floor. And social and human capital have a great destiny in front of them if we can get the KPIs, the key performance indicators, right. And the way we do that is by participating at the table with the people setting the standards and designing the metrics. And so one of the projects that we're doing at ASBN with our partner Social Economy Europe is we are organizing the world's global social economy, which is about 6 million enterprises. We've got about half of them already organized. And we're going to achieve critical mass and get to the table so that no one can talk about human and social capital without definitions from, by, for, of the people doing the work. And those definitions will drive funding in the right ways with the right impacts, and we'll get out of this trickle-down miasma and horror that we've been living with under shareholder primacy.
Anyone else want in on the principles piece?
Yes, Clay, I can. Thank you, Valerie and Michael, for what you're saying there. You know, the way we view it, the two principles are place-based and community-driven. You know, there's no one size fits all that's gonna, you know, help everybody. I mean, you look at the tribes in South Dakota, we each all have our own different issues that we think. And, you know, throughout my life and from what I hear from my parents and, you know, other relatives in the community, you know, what I've seen, you know, there's been a lot of people coming in, you know, I'd say a lot with good intentions, maybe some not, coming to help us with their idea of what our lives should be. And that has, you know, decade over decade shown it's not working. You know, we need to be in control of where we're going. Our input needs to be taken first and foremost, you know, based on our values, our history, our priorities. So that's, you know, one thing I guess that would go over everybody is that everybody's unique. Every place is unique, and that needs to be identified. And then it needs to, again, in the same breath, needs to be community driven. Solutions, you know, that are affecting the community need to be created by that community. You know, we need to identify the problems. We need to identify our priorities. So, you know, again, in Indian country, we've been told how to live, how to eat, how to learn, how to be successful, which is completely different from the way of life that we were accustomed to for centuries. So, yes, you know, the place-based and community-driven principles have to be in place for any of these to work in each individual community.
David, I know you want to move on, but I want to just add something to what Clay said that I think brings it into perspective. So I was working with his predecessor, Wizipan, and he needed to raise capital for this bison, you know, company, which is fantastic and has the ability to be a commercial entity that can really bring income into, you know, the reservation. And I agree, they have to be able to do it on their own, the way they want to do it culturally. And he was talking about I said, what's your wish list? And he named all the other areas they wanted to buy so they could grow their herd. It was about 100 million. And I just want to lay out a fact that everyone needs to understand. 20% of small businesses are founded by people of color. Less than 1% end up being big businesses that are publicly traded. Something happens in that spectrum. There are tons of programs to help small businesses. If we were to raise 100 million for Clay's bison company, there's no philanthropic support to raise 100 million. That's all the capital we're talking about that needs to shift. So if we shift the capital into fund managers that will then fund his company with 100 million, that's what I'm talking about, because it's not going to happen if we just focus on the philanthropy as the solutions. I think we all have to continue to work in philanthropy, but we have to understand the gap is big.
Great. Well, let's pick up on that maybe a little bit more. Val, you laid out a number of different ideas, but you know, one of the concerns that we've had is the you know, again, as April speaks to it quite eloquently, is just, and you all do, is really the incredible disinvestment, underinvestment, non-investment in the communities, across this country, across the world, and the like that. And, it's so important, as you've been saying, to move the capital in significant ways, right? And to move lots of different forms of capital. So given this historic, in non-investment, what are some of the things that would be the leverage points, in addition to, Val, what you've already begun to lay out? What else do we need to pull out for us to be able to create greater systemic change as it comes to moving capital in order to be able to shift the economy?
I'll jump in quickly for that. I think what's really interesting is a big factor that's missing is pedagogy. Oftentimes you sit at the table with so many people who have good intentions, but really just focus in the moment. That we woke up and we thought, and we think all these problems started today. And more to Clay's points, it started when the first boats landed on this continent, and it's now curated from generation to generation. And even having this conversation with the clients we work with, for example, a developer who comes and says, how can I be intentional about racial equity? They don't understand the sites they're building on, or the deeper histories, and giving that curated understanding, which often is cut out of a budget and needs incredible investment to understand the why of this work. It goes from, doing the typical patriarchal approaches of saving Black and Brown communities as incapable of doing it on their own. Again, the points that have been highlighted, to how do we think innovatively, even from aesthetically, how we design buildings that don't reinforce this hierarchy of othering within the human value. And with this particular developer, what was interesting was this concept of food apartheid or food access. And the fact that why create a food pantry or a soup kitchen that reinforces or perpetuates stereotypes around who accesses these spaces, and stop investing into that model to shift to now a food cafe that's locally owned, possibly a cooperative, that now begins to create intersectionality points where a former public housing site that people cross the street and begin to have communal spaces together, versus these demarcations that are with us as a result of legacies of redlining and urban renewal. So one, you drive local economy, it's locally owned, but you also create points of healing within an aesthetic space that doesn't reinforce these paradigms of us and them, and again, this moral environmentalism of how investment comes in. But that doesn't come by accident. You have to have an intentional understanding of the why that then informs a process that then informs how these outputs show up spatially within the built environment. And I fear that if we don't have the investment now, particularly as this infrastructure bill is coming down the pipeline, it goes back to Clay's point. How many generations are we going to be setting up that is not closing a wealth gap, that is only exacerbating these existing conditions? So what is the agency that each of us has to really begin to create this collective of understanding how we come together? And each of us has a significant role, because we are not just working at the moment, we're working with deep policies of scientific racism, eugenics, all of this that has been encrusted into our entire system in the built environment. And this is the work that's necessary to say, no, not today. We're not doing it this way. There is another way to do this. And it gives us agency, again, to scale our collective humanity.
Anyone else want in on this one? Okay. So I think that we're going to just ask folks to put some in the Q&A, but you tell me if I'm wrong. But we'll let Talissa or Isaac put something in the chat to let people know how to ask their questions. But one more was, listen, ASBN really believes that for the systemic change to take place, we need to change the rules of the game, right? We need to change the public policies that are out there at the many different levels, the federal, the state, the local level. And so just wondering if any of you have thoughts about what some of the game-changing policies would be. Again, we touched on it a little bit, but if there's any more you want to add to what what the toolbox of policies could look like that could create the change that we're talking about today.
I'll jump in from my experience. I'm working right now with the U.S. Treasury, and Clay, you were formerly with Native American Bank, and there's a lot of policies and regulations about government support into communities of color and small business. And like a BIA guarantee, you still have a bank that then has to loan the funds. And when we're not working with Native American Bank and kind of the banks at large, kind of going back to what April was saying, there can't be that white savior complex of we have the money and therefore you are, below us in some sort of power dynamic. And what we see are sometimes extractive term sheets, really difficult due diligence that goes beyond the scope of the loan. And so I think those of us, this is getting very specific and in the weeds, but those of us that are involved with policy, those programs have to really think about what we can change to make that power dynamic between those with the money and those receiving the money change. Because, to many of your points, especially Damien's, we have power and voice and wealth. And I think Michael made this in human capital within our communities. We do need resources and dollars, but we don't need them to come with a lot of uncomfortable policies that start to hurt our communities. So it is changing that power dynamic when we shift these resources.
Right. David, can I jump in on this? Yeah, so though, feel free to accuse me of broken record syndrome for what I'm about to say, but we have been advocating for tax parity for quite some time against incredible odds, because right now the rules are rigged and certain structures get certain deals, and they fight like the Dickens to protect those deals, because when there's capital to give away, everybody jumps on their bandwagon because they have the best deals for the outgoing investor. And what that does is that prescribes the structure that the incoming worker owners are going to have to adhere to. For me, that's like never leaving the plantation. So we want complete tax parity between all ownership structures. That way, people can culturally choose what's culturally best for them. They'll have a much higher success. It'll be much more indigenous, much more authentic. And the metrics show that'll be more successful and more profitable. And as I said earlier, profitability is a must because that's how you afford your own values. So slowly but surely, people are understanding that tax parity on ownership structures is a vital mainstream path to freedom.
Great. Anyone else on policy? April?
Just a quick, HUD in particular, with a lot of the housing subsidies that come down the pipeline, I think linguistics and vernacular can do a huge leap forward in really shifting perception and cognitive conditioning. And what I mean by that is things like LIHTC, low income tax housing credits, and others. We need to reframe this language around what Val and Michael and Clay and Damien are highlighting about ownership. And that when we remove this concept of, we can't speak equity and then we say low income housing, because we know immediately what that's associated with. So I think a big policy push is really working with agencies like HUD to understand how money comes in without ever having to re-stigmatize again or create spectacle of certain demographics, giving a long history of this work. So investment that has proper linguistics is a critical policy point that we can begin working on.
Amen to that.
And David, I would add that, Michael said parity, and we talk about equity. And I'm going to use just a brief example here in Leimert Park. Leimert Park, again, the Black center of culture and highest concentration of Black people in Los Angeles. Most people bought their homes 10 years ago at maybe $300,000 to $400,000. They now go north of $1 million. And the conversation in California is pretty robust because we've got a reparations commission. Many people, there's a citywide reparations commission. Many people are talking about certain things, but they're not necessarily diving into the current imbalance that we have. I think we need to get beyond just simple parity and actually talk about advantages for traditionally harmed communities. because you could provide us, even though we now know that the same credit score and income of a Black person will not get them a loan approval that a white person with the exact same will be given. No, we have to be advantaged because there are decades that have gotten to, and many systems that have gotten to this systemic gap, this generational gap between families. So even if we could mandate, and many people try to, that banks have to give African Americans and other traditionally harmed people the same loan agreement, that doesn't advantage us when trying to simply buy homes in our own community. There are a myriad of things that I think need to be corrected, but be corrected in a manner that recognizes that we are 50 yards behind in a 100-yard dash, and it will require a rebalancing of these policies, not just say, oh, we're giving you the exact same thing. No, you got to do a lot of work to repair the harm that's already done.
Great. Thank you for all of you for that. There was one question in there, and perhaps we can grab 2 minutes and that we'll close it out. But it said, can you speak to the processes that you utilize to bring together your communities, including marginalized communities, individuals within the community, to explore and identify the shared community priorities, and then to advocate for those priorities and make these happen? Any number of you have been incredibly successful on bringing your community together. You want to we'll just grab a few of you quickly, but you want to just comment on some of the processes that you've used, some of the ways that you've engaged your community.
I'll jump in, because I've worked with a lot of tribal communities, and I'm going to just keep going back to my thesis of shifting capital so that the communities can start to heal themselves. And I think we should be clear that wealth also in this country equals power and voice in many ways. When I was doing my study of the wealth gap, turned out that Goldman Sachs, one of the oldest and largest cap financial institutions, over the years have had many people in the federal government and actually in charge of programs that then sent money back to them. And I just use that example because what I've seen in our communities, as we get resources, then we start to elevate and train and educate people that can then be leaders in their own community. And as to Clay's point, be co-creating those solutions with their community, but now with the tools that they need. And so again, you cannot separate the wealth gap, in my opinion. And as we shift that capital, it will also equal that power and that voice and that elevation in those communities.
Anyone else want to take 30 seconds to a minute on this one? Sorry, we're just trying to squeeze it in. Damien, April, come on. We know you guys got some tools.
It's just elbow grease. I mean, you've got to bring people together. You've got to have institutions that are democratically controlled. You've got to have leadership ladders so that individuals who are just knocking on doors that don't have all the degrees and all the experience can actually get to the board levels. It's elbow grease. There's nothing, there's no secret to it.
That's right, Dave. To quote Madagascar 1, 2, and 3, you got to move it, move it.
Well, great. Last words, April. Clay, anything else you wanted to add to this one?
Agree with Damien on that. It's a never-ending process, basically. I mean, we just keep doing it, keep working, keep moving it, as was just said.
Great.
There was a question really quickly from a Taylor in the audience, and how do you invest to create the ROI or return on investment on these? For me, for my sector, architecture is a multi-billion-dollar a year industry. Could you imagine if you actually invested in startups that have equity, justice, and healing at the core ethos of their practice? And Trahan does it, but we need to scale because we're shifting an entire traditional approach. I don't think there's any question what the ROI would be on that type of an investment in a firm like that. So how do you bring capital into that intentionality where you're not selling to people the value of equity, justice, and healing every single day, but have the agency to just do the work?
So, with that, we're going to try and close it out. We're going to invite, all those of you that are with us today, all those of you that are viewing this, to really reach out. We take it very seriously, this movement building, this alliance building, the need to really work with each other. with great mutual respect, but with the aim towards building a greater voice and power together as well. So, with that, I want to thank Val and April and Damien and Clay and Michael for being a part of this conversation, but even more importantly, for being a part of the work that is going to be the foundation for how we really transform our economy and this country. So thank you all for joining us today, and to be continued. Move it, move it, move it. Thank you all.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Take care, everyone.
Yes, thank you all. It was a pleasure.
Bye.